طيب من الحاجات برضو المهمة قوي، احنا بس نسينا نكتب البريكوشنز بتاعة الكارديوثوراسيك ريشيو، يعني علشان اطمن انه my measurement of the cardiothoracic ratio is correct، فممكن اتسأل what are the precautions for. انا كده كده عموما هكمل السيشن علشان في كذا question مهمة عايزة اقول لكم عليها. what are، وبعدين ابعت لكم recording ان شاء الله. what are the precautions for a normal cardiothoracic ratio؟ في حاجتين لازم اخلي بالي منهم قوي. اول حاجة the position of the clavicles، the position of the clavicles، يعني I have to make sure that the patient is not rotated. The clavicles should be symmetric. وعشان يبقوا الclavicles symmetric يبقى لازم لو ده الsternum يبقى the visible length of the clavicle on the left side should be equal to the visible length on the anterior surface of the clavicle on the right side. يعني لو if you measure the clavicle كده وطلعت مثلا 10 millimeters ودي طلعت بس 8 مليمتر، لا يبقى العيان روتيتد كده، ويبقى انت لو حسبت الكارديوثوراسيك ريشيو هيطلع مش مظبوط. فدي اول حاجه. الحاجه الثانيه انه the patient should be in deep inspiration. The patient should be in deep inspiration. In deep inspiration يعني انت تقول للعيان ياخد نفس عميق جدا وبعدين you ask him to hold his breath in deep inspiration and then you take the x-ray while the patient is holding his breath in deep inspiration. طيب انا اتاكد منين ان التكنيشن اللي كان بياخد الاكس-راي للعيان عمل ده مظبوط؟ ابص على البوزيشن of the diaphragm. المفروض انه يكون anteriorly عند ال 5th to 6th rib و posteriorly عند ال 8th to 9th rib أو ال 8th to 10th rib. فدي بالنسبة للprecautions. من ضمن الحاجات كمان اللي احنا لازم نعرفها مثلا يعني question 10 مثلا the need، ولا بلاش خلينا نعمل الأصعب الأول، the murmurs in valvular lesions. The murmurs in valvular lesions. يعني ممكن أقول لك الquestion هتبقى describe. الquestion هتبقى describe. When I describe the murmur in a valvular lesion يبقى I have my description should include the following. يبقى ال description of a murmur should include the timing of the murmur and the auscultatory area where you can best hear the murmur. وطبعا بالتالي يبقى انت لازم تعرف الاسكالتاتوري areas، وهنقولهم احنا قلناهم المره اللي فاتت في الريفيجن اللي فات، ليكم مش فاكرين.
الاورتيك
طيب.
والمايترال والترايكاسبيد
لازم نعرفهم كويس قوي. طيب يعني اذا انا مهم التايمنج. يعني ايه تايمنج؟ يعني اقول اذا كان المurmur is a systolic murmur ولا اقول المurmur is a diastolic murmur. الاسكالتاتوري area يعني اقول هو على الميترال area ولا الترايكاسبيد area ولا الاورتيك area ولا البولمونري area. وبالتالي لو انا جيت سالت مثلا واقول انه question number 11 describe the murmur in mitral، أنا طبعا هاخد a few examples بس احنا لازم نكون عارفينهم كلهم in mitral stenosis. فأنا لازم أبقى في دماغي الهيموداينامكس. يعني mitral stenosis يعني عندي الميترال فالف اللي هي بين اللفت atrium وبين اللفت ventricle is narrow، يبقى هيحصل resistance to flow. وطبعا ممكن بدل describe the murmur أجيب justify the murmur. فيبقى في عندي turbulent blood flow. لو جبت كلمة justify يبقى لازم نتكلم عن turbulence، لأنه استحالة هيكون في murmur إلا لو كان في turbulence. وفي الميترال stenosis turbulence هتكون بسبب a narrow valve أو a narrow pathway for the blood. يبقى لما البلد بيكون بيعدي من left atrium ل left ventricle هسمع murmur due to turbulence. يبقى this is a systolic murmur. يبقى if you're ever asked about description of the murmur in mitral stenosis, first of all, you have to say that it is a systolic murmur. With second, you have to say that it is on the mitral area. كفاية ان انا اقول on the mitral area؟ لا, I have to describe the mitral area. تمام؟ اوكي جايز، فهمنا الكلام ده؟
يس يا دكتور.
طيب systolic murmur مهم كمان نعرف هو S1، ادي S1 وادي S2 وبعدين ادي الفولوينج S1 وبعديها S2. تلاحظوا طبعا انا ممكن اطلب منكم ان انتوا ترسموا التايم لاين دي. لازم نرسم التايم لاين الS2 والS1 اللي بعديها الديستانس اكبر من الS1 والS2 اللي بعديها، لان ده هو السيستولي وده هو الدايستولي and the length of the diastole should be longer than the length of the systole. مهم نعرف S1 is due to closure of the AV valves and S2 is due to closure of the semi-lunar valves. تمام؟ أنا كده I'll be recording the rest of the questions so you can go to Mr. نجم عشان ما يتضايقش منكم، وأنا هكمل ال questions وأبعت لكم السيشن إن شاء الله. Okay guys؟
يا دكتور.
Thank you.
دكتور عندي سؤال مهم جدا، عندي سؤال مهم جدا. هو ان شاء الله الكتاب هيتحط في اللايبرري صح ولا ايه؟
إن شاء الله يس، لو أنتوا عايزين، لو أنتوا مش عايزين خلاص.
عايزين طبعا. لا عايزين طبعا.
خلاص انا هاخده معايا يوم الثلاث واديه لمسز غاده ان شاء الله عشان تتفرج عليه الاول وبعدين تحطه في السكول لايبرري ان شاء الله.
تمام، تخيرك تخيرك.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Happy.
You're most welcome. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.
مع السلامة.
مع السلامة. Question number 12 would be about the description. Let's take another valve. For example, describe the murmur in aortic incompetence. طبعا you don't have to memorize everything لأنه everything would be mixed up at the end of the day, but you have to understand the hemodynamics, how blood flows, how turbulence occurs. Is it during systole or during diastole? So this is the first question you have to ask yourself. So describe the murmur in aortic incompetence. So if I draw the left ventricle like this and then draw the aorta and imagine that during systole, the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta, but during diastole, the left ventricle relaxes and no more pumps blood into the aorta, and the pressure inside the left ventricle diminishes, and therefore there is tendency of the blood to fall down into or to backflow into the left ventricle. But what prevents this tendency of the blood to backflow into the cavity of the left ventricle is the presence of a competent aortic valve, meaning that it is an aortic valve that is capable of complete closure during diastole. So if the aortic valve is incompetent, this simply means one important thing. You can just write this flow chart in order to be able to describe the murmur accurately. So if you have aortic incompetence, this means that the aortic valve does not close. It opens during systole, as we have seen, and allows the passage of blood, but it does not close properly during diastole. Does not close properly during diastole. So during diastole, there will be backflow of blood. And since the backflow of blood into the left ventricle is not the normal pathway, then this simply means one thing, that we are going to have a turbulent blood flow. We are going to have a turbulent blood flow. When does this turbulence occur? This turbulence occurs when the left ventricle is relaxed. And this makes sense because as long as the left ventricle is relaxed and is in diastole, the pressure lowers down, there is tendency for backflow, and if the valve is incompetent, then there will be turbulence during diastole, and therefore we would have a diastolic murmur. يبقى أنا كده جاوبت نص السؤال إن أنا قلت the timing of the murmur, and that diastolic murmur is heard over the aortic area, and you describe the aortic area. This is how you proceed for every valvular lesion. I'm not gonna cover all the lesions, but it's up to you to decide whether the murmur is systolic or diastolic and on which area. On which area is very easy to decide because the mitral valve is best heard at the mitral area, which is the apex, fifth left intercostal space. Tricuspid lesions are best heard at the tricuspid area. Again, fifth intercostal space to the left of the sternal border. Aortic lesions, whether incompetence or stenosis, are heard best at the aortic area, and the pulmonary lesions are best heard at the pulmonary area. You might also be, of course, this is a bit confusing, but you have to be trained on all types of lesions, meaning that you have to be trained on mitral stenosis, mitral incompetence, tricuspid stenosis, tricuspid incompetence, pulmonary stenosis and incompetence, aortic stenosis and incompetence. And it's worth saying that they are opposite to each other, meaning that, for example, the murmur in aortic incompetence, as you see here, is a diastolic murmur, but the murmur of mitral incompetence is a systolic murmur. So if a particular murmur due to an atrioventricular valve is systolic, then the same, for example, due to stenosis, then the stenosis of the semi-lunar lesions will be systolic. Let's say it again. For example, if we talk about mitral stenosis, the murmur of mitral stenosis and the murmur of tricuspid stenosis, both murmurs are diastolic murmurs. لأنه a resistance to blood flow occurs while the blood is flowing during diastole from the atria to the ventricles. But in case of mitral stenosis, it is best heard over the mitral area, whereas in tricuspid stenosis, it is best heard over the tricuspid area. But if you consider stenosis not of the atrioventricular valves, but of the semi-lunar valves, and if you consider aortic stenosis or pulmonary stenosis, then the murmur will be a systolic murmur. Do I have to learn this by heart? No, but I have to imagine the hemodynamics of the heart. I have to imagine how blood flows inside the cavities of the heart. So both give rise to a systolic murmur, but in case of aortic stenosis, you have a systolic murmur over the aortic area. And in case of pulmonary stenosis, you have a murmur over the pulmonary area. This is in relation to mitral stenosis of the valves. On the other hand, if we consider mitral incompetence, backflow into the mitral of, by the way, incompetence doesn't mean backflow. Incompetence means that the valve does not close properly. Backflow is a result of incompetence. Backflow is the result of the valve being incompetent. So if we consider mitral incompetence and tricuspid incompetence, then both give rise to a systolic murmur. But the difference, of course, is in the location. That's why we always say that you cannot describe a murmur just by saying that the murmur is systolic or diastolic, but you have to mention on which area you have best heard that murmur. So a murmur of mitral incompetence would best have been heard on the mitral area, whereas the murmur of tricuspid incompetence would best have been heard on the tricuspid area, fifth intercostal space, left sternal border. On the other hand, if I have this, those are the atrioventricular valves. If I consider now the semi-lunar valves, then I would talk about aortic incompetence and pulmonary incompetence, okay? So if I consider the semi-lunar valves, then I would talk about aortic incompetence from one side and pulmonary incompetence from the other side. Both will give rise to a turbulent flow, both will give rise to a murmur, but that if the murmur of mitral incompetence and tricuspid incompetence is systolic, then automatically the murmur here would be a diastolic murmur. But the difference between the two would be that this diastolic murmur would best have been heard on the aortic area, which you have to describe, and that for pulmonary incompetence would best have been heard on the pulmonary area that you have to describe. So these last two slides, or the slides that I've edited last, are like a summary for the valvular lesions and the description of the murmurs for the valvular lesions. Now we move on to question number 13, which talks about the differences between an artery and a vein. Of course, you know that both arteries and veins are made of three distinct layers. The first layer is what we call tunica intima, which is the endothelium, the inner endothelium, with the underlying connective tissue and elastic fibers. So this is actually connective tissue plus elastic fibers. And then you have the tunica media. You have the tunica media. And the tunica media consists mainly of smooth muscles. And it's called tunica media because it is the middle layer. And then we have the tunica adventitia, which is the outermost layer. And it again consists of connective tissue and elastic fibers. Both the artery and the vein consist of the same layers, but there are differences between them. So if you were ever asked to compare and contrast between an artery and a vein, you have to compare and contrast the anatomy and the physiology. So first of all, let's talk about the anatomy. Arteries, for example, if we talk about the anatomy of the artery, and then number two, we would talk about the functions or the physiology of each of the artery and vein, then the artery would have a much thicker wall because the artery has a thicker tunica media. So it has a thicker muscle layer, and the vein, of course, would have a thinner muscle layer. The wall of the artery has more elastic fibers. Here we have less elastic fibers. The lumen of the artery is always patent. So the lumen, always patent, meaning that the artery looks like this, having a thicker wall and always patent, whereas the vein is more or less collapsed, meaning that it's not as circular as the artery. So the vein is more or less collapsed. Concerning the function, as you know, arteries carry blood from the heart to an organ that is not the heart, whereas the vein carries from an organ that is not the heart from an organ to the heart. Of course, the artery has a higher pressure than the vein. The vein has a lower pressure. Since the artery has more elastic fibers, then it shows more elastic recoil. And this leads us to question number 14, which talks about the varicose veins. Varicose veins. There is another important difference in anatomy between the artery and the vein, that the large veins have valves all along their courses. This is important. They have valves all along their courses to prevent backflow of blood. Whereas in case of the artery, it is only the large arteries. It is only the large arteries, like what? Like the aorta and the pulmonary artery, that have at their beginnings only, not along their courses. And this leads us to the varicose veins. So what are varicose veins? Varicose veins are tortuous, enlarged, visible veins, tortuous, enlarged, visible veins under the surface of the skin, under the skin surface. They look like snakes under the surface of the skin. If you're ever asked about the causes of the varicose veins, we have two major causes for the varicose veins. We have weak muscles around the veins, weak muscles around the veins. And the second cause is weak valves, weak incompetent valves that do not close properly in order to prevent the pooling down of blood into the lower limbs. How would a patient present in such a case? He would present, of course, with the enlarged visible veins under the surface of the skin, but also he would present with lower limb edema, lower limb edema. So how would we treat the patient in such a case if we talk about treatment of varicose veins? Of course, first of all, you have prophylaxis. You have to avoid standing up for long periods of time. Number two, you have to encourage muscle contraction. You have to encourage muscle contraction. And you have the third is sclerotherapy. You can inject a chemical, and that chemical causes sclerosis or stiffness of the veins so that they are no more tortuous, and this minimizes the pain that the patient suffers from. You also have to know the lymphatic organs, and you have to know the difference between the lymphatics and the veins. Of course, as you know, the lymphatics belong to an open system, so the lymphatics are mainly open-ended, whereas the veins are connected to the capillaries, so they start by the capillaries. You also have to know that the lymphatics contain lymph, that is a clear fluid that is full of lymphocytes, whereas the veins contain blood. The lymphatics have walls that are made of one layer of cells, whereas the veins are, they have 3 layers, tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica adventitia. We have to also know the arrhythmias. Last time, I think we talked about the regular arrhythmias like sinus tachycardia and sinus bradycardia, or we can call them arrhythmias originating in the sinoatrial node. So if we talk about arrhythmias, when you study arrhythmias, you have to have a scheme like this. There are arrhythmias originating in the sinoatrial node, arrhythmias originating in the SA node. You have other arrhythmias that originate in atrial ectopic foci, and a third group of arrhythmias that originate in ventricular ectopic foci, The first group of arrhythmias that originate in the sinoatrial node include, of course, sinus tachycardia and sinus bradycardia. The second group that you learned and that are that originate in atrial ectopic foci, meaning that they originate in parts of the heart muscles that are not related to the sinoatrial node. So you can have atrial flutter, and atrial fibrillation. And then we have a third group of arrhythmias that originate in ventricular ectopic foci. So you can also have ventricular flutter and ventricular fibrillation. And here we can add a fourth group that is the AV nodal arrhythmias, like the AV nodal rhythm. And of course, you have to study very well the characteristics, the ECG characteristics of each of these arrhythmias. As I told you before, you might have a question that tells you to justify, for example, the difference in composition, justify the difference in blood composition between, and I can choose any pairs of blood vessels. For example, we might ask about the difference between the pulmonary veins and the pulmonary arteries, for example, or I might ask about the difference between the aorta and the inferior vena cava, for example. I might ask about the difference in blood composition between, more specifically, between the arteriolar end of the capillaries and the venous end of the capillaries. In all of these questions, it's as if you were asked about the type of exchange that occurs. Which means what? Which means that in order to justify the difference between the pulmonary vein composition and the pulmonary arteries composition, you have to talk about the exchange that occurs in the lungs, which is the alveolo-capillary exchange. Okay? Similarly, if you want to talk about the difference between the aorta and the inferior vena cava, you have to talk about tissue capillary exchange from one side. For example, you can say here it is a bit more complicated because the inferior vena cava carries deoxygenated blood because it collects venous blood that was collected after tissue capillary exchange. But the aorta carries oxygenated blood because it takes it from the left ventricle after alveolo-capillary exchange. So here the question would be more elaborated. In arteriolar end and venous end, it all depends upon where we are talking. Are we talking at the tissues? We cannot leave it open like this, or are we talking in the lungs? Okay. You also have to know the cardiac events, for example, or in a particular cardiac event, for example. So cardiac events are an important type of questions. A certain cardiac event, for example, ventricular systole. I might ask you to describe what happens in the heart during ventricular systole, for example. So what happens in a particular cardiac event, for example, in ventricular systole? In ventricular systole, the right, I'll just give you one example, but I might ask you about right ventricular systole, right ventricular diastole, left ventricular systole, left ventricular diastole, atrial systole, atrial diastole. Let's here, for example, talk about right ventricular systole. So the right ventricle will contract during systole and pump deoxygenated blood into what? Into the pulmonary artery. This is the basic piece of information on which you're going to base all the rest. Because if the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary artery, then the pulmonary valve should be open and the tricuspid valve should be closed. So here, the other event or the other thing that happens in that cardiac event, or I might ask you, what are the cardiac events that occur during right ventricular systole? So the first event is contraction and pumping of deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary artery. The second event would be that the tricuspid valve would be closed. Why would it be closed? To prevent backflow during systole, and the pulmonary valve would be open. Last thing to say before I leave you is that you have to know the difference between a segment and an interval on an ECG. And of course, as you know, the interval is nothing but a segment plus a wave, a segment plus a wave. So, and you have to know what each segment indicates. You have to know the PR segment. It represents the conduction along the AV node from the atria to the ventricle. So it might be prolonged in case of AV nodal delay. This is the PR segment. You have the ST segment, that is from the end of the S wave to the beginning of the T wave, and it might be elevated in myocardial infarction or depressed in angina pectoris. You also have, for example, the PR interval, and the PR interval represents the P wave plus the PR segment. So it represents the spread of depolarization over the atria. Sorry, it starts here. It starts here. So it represents the spread of depolarization on the surface of the atrium plus the conduction along the AV node. And as you know, the conduction along the AV node, or the main function of the AV node, is to delay and relay first, to transmit the impulse to the ventricles, but to transmit it with a delay to give enough time for this is important. Why does it cause a delay? To give enough time for the ventricles to fill and to prevent simultaneous contraction of the atria and ventricles, which would cause an inefficient contraction. Okay. You also have to know what the QT interval is from the beginning of the Q wave to the end of the T wave, and if it is prolonged, the patient is liable to get a serious fatal arrhythmias. Thank you, guys. This is the end of our session, and wish you the best of luck, inshallah, on your final test.